minimizing it. And that may mean some strategic cultivations here or there, but nonetheless, I think it's still an appropriate word, minimize. Maximize diversity. We'll share a little bit. I'm going to talk a bit about diversity. This is one that I will focus in on a bit here in this discussion. We kind of covered in a way quite a bit on keep the soil covered. I think you've got the emphasis of why that's so important. It's about keeping green plants and photosynthesis turned on as much as possible. And that's what we talked about in part one of the lecture. And that really goes hand in hand with the living roots, those root exudates that we talked about. And then, okay, if you can, and I know not all farmers are interested in integrating livestock, but there are some benefits from the animal, from the rumination, from the manure, from the animal interaction, and I'll share a quick example of this too. So again, where possible, if there is an opportunity to integrate some livestock, I would really also support that. And I know that that's where conservation agriculture differs from soil health principles. Conservation agriculture really has pretty much excluded the animal part. There's a lot of overlap, focuses on the rest of the principles, but kind of keeps that one out. I think I'm not saying that livestock are essential. I think we can do a lot of good without livestock as well, but I do really support that where they are included, there are additional gains to be had. So let's dive into some examples that we can kind of use to then manage this and manage soil health. And the first one would be even just to think about our cash crops themselves, how we manage the plants. And I talked about this before, plant nutrition and plant diversity are two key tools that I would use to manage plant health to then help drive some of those changes in soil health. And so really, as I emphasize, it's all about roots. Roots are really what makes soil. Root feeds soil. There's a lot of direct benefit to roots. So trying to integrate plants, species, or varieties that have big rooting characteristics or high root to shoot ratios is very important. So if you can have some deeper rooted plants in the mix, I think this is valuable, and I think this is a kind of a breeding goal, maybe a bit more longer term, is that we actually do need to be breeding some varieties that do produce bigger roots. This will also give us more resilience, more exploration of the soil. That's what's going to help us use a bit less fertilizer, increase the resilience in terms of soil moisture access and that kind of thing. So I think going forward, breeding better varieties with better rooting characteristics would be very helpful in this discussion. But even as a more immediate short term, having a perennials in the rotation or having a perennial phase. So if you are arable in a cropping context, widening your rotation and putting in a perennial phase of maybe 2 years, maybe 3, even if you could. Okay, that is great to have those perennial plants because perennials allocate more carbon down below ground. And of course, you're all here to talk about agroforestry today in the context of that project. So having forests, having alley cropping and agroforestry type projects that you're also going to be learning about today. This is also a great example of having some of those perennial plants who are permanently a bit more active and restructuring throughout that growing season. And so I think these things help with rotations, but it just also helps with diversity of plants and particularly the deeper rooting systems. So I think even the focus can also still be on productive plants is the point here. I'm going to talk about some other companions and other areas, but I'm just pointing out that even the way in which we grow our cash crops or the types of plants we grow, I think is very, very relevant and can still have productive gains and ecosystem gains is what I mean there. And I think that's captured perfectly in this picture. It was the transition away from a lot of perennial based systems as we kind of started doing agriculture. We kind of steered a little more towards these annual based systems. And the first and foremost to point out is just that as soon as we have an annual plant, the annual plants, they allocate more carbon above ground. They don't invest so heavily in roots for the obvious reason that they're only going to be alive for 1 year. Once they set seed and reproduce, they've completed their life cycle. So they focus more heavily on seed production and finishing that life cycle in year 1. They don't invest so heavily in roots, unlike our perennial friends who, of course, will be back again next year. So they need to invest in those. They need to invest in those roots to have reserves and energy to then resprout, to regrow the following spring. So perennials allocate more carbon below ground down into the soil. And this is a big part of why we've seen soil health. And this is one of the reasons we've seen some soil health declines with intensification of agriculture, is this shift away from perennials and that beneficial rooting characteristic into annuals and their less active rooting characteristics. So wherever we can get perennials, the better. And even this is my point there also about maybe even the plant choice, choosing varieties that maybe also have a bit better rooting characteristics. And here you're looking at a nice example of just some wheat grown in the same potting soil, just a little experiment, planted on the same day, same soil, same growing conditions. And on the left-hand side here, you can see this is an einkorn wheat, and on the right-hand side we have a modern durum, a durum wheat. And so these two plants are grown in the same conditions, but you can see that the einkorn on the left-hand side, it has a lot more heavier, bigger rooting characteristics. And this is what's going to help, of course, that plant scavenge deeper nutrients from the soil, more moisture from the soil. That's going to reduce our dependency on those external inputs. We have bred plants to be high yielding, yes, and that's good. We all need to eat, of course, but that high yielding traits that we've bred for has come at a cost. It's been a trade-off, and that trade-off was below ground carbon, was root carbon. And so again, this is another one of the reasons shift out of perennials and then plant breeding towards these very high yielding varieties has come at a trade-off to root biomass, root production. And I really believe that the varieties in which we grow are also a part of this decline that we've seen in soil health. Okay, so then we could think about some inputs to help manage, encourage rooting characteristics, or encourage some of the soil health and biological function. This is where I'll talk a little bit to the question that we had earlier about compost teas and the like. Okay, how do we want to feed the soil? I talked about feeding the soil. How do we improve the soil? Well, okay, more specifically in terms of feeding, the biology, okay, it's some of these classic things that you're all very familiar with, the use of compost, other organic amendments, manures and the like, growing cover crops, green manures, that type of thing, minimizing disturbance as we also touched on. But then beyond that, we've got then maybe these more specific things like maybe a compost extract or a biofertilizer, sorry, that should say biofertilizer, other biofertilizers, biostimulants. These are compounds that just stimulate plant growth, maybe stimulate deeper rooting characteristics to drive some of these benefits, and or even more plant species diversity. And we'll return to that one. So a bit later on. So these are the types of then inputs, more of an input-minded approach still, where we can use certain additives to support and improve soil biology, soil health. And so to that question we had there earlier, yeah, look, I'm open-minded to the role of biofertilizers. I mean, think about compost itself. Compost is a biofertilizer. That's not controversial. I mean, manure, we could argue manure is a biofertilizer. It's got microbials in it. And this is not controversial. This is not a controversial input. No one kind of thinks that this is what we should be doing, this or not adding those organisms, this whole kind of debate about feeding the natives versus introducing foreign. We do this already with compost, with manures, for example. Okay, now from that, we could also then take compost and water, mix that together and extract out some of those organisms, and then have a liquid solution that we could then apply to the soil, probiotics for the soil, essentially. But really, I think the key here is that, and this is part of that debate, and I don't want to kind of dwell on this too much, but because it's a big question, and I love this question. I love kind of getting into the nuance of this debate. But I think the point is that when people say, "Oh, don't bother applying microbes to the soil," there's already billions and billions of there. It's literally a drop in the ocean. You're not changing anything by just putting a few grams of these microbial spores in. I really agree with that sentiment, but I think that the nuance of this is that where I would promote the use of a biofertilizer or a compost extract in this example is as a seed treatment or an injection going into the furrow, or a seedling dip for a vegetable seedling or a tree in your context, um, to put those organisms right there around the plant, on the seed, on the root system, right there. You're not trying to change the entire soil profile with those organisms. That's not the goal. The goal is to have those organisms growing next to a living root and let the plant use them and recruit them as and when it wants to. And if it doesn't want to, it won't. And if it does want to, it will. And that's the beauty of the compost extract specifically. It is a more biologically diverse microbial inoculant. So many of those organisms that get applied, yes, they will not never get recruited. They will end up being dormant, they will end up dying and decomposing. But some of those organisms will get activated and recruit those organisms. Okay, and so that's why we go for very diverse inoculant, like a compost extract. And if you put a wheat seed, that wheat will recruit the organisms it wants. If you put a legume, the legume will recruit different organisms. If you put a tree, a hazelnut tree, it's going to recruit different organisms. So that's the beauty of the diverse inoculant. You just let the plant do the rest of the work. It will recruit the specific one it needs. And that's why I think if you are going to apply fertilizers, be that a biofertilizers, be that a compost extract or other even commercial products, for me, they only primarily make sense putting them on the plant, on the seed, in the furrow, in the planting hole, that kind of a thing. Okay, so that's kind of my view on that. And look, I really support compost extracts in that regard. And I think that I'm sure there are more and more commercial products out there on the market. And some of these may have relevance. They can be very specific in their function, like end fixing or suppressing disease. There's all sorts of kind of options out there. And my personal hierarchy here is that I would say that one, first and foremost, just follow soil health principles, feed the natives, take care of who is already there. This is first step. Two, if you're going to introduce new microbes and apply an inoculant, then two, I would be using the strategies that involve making the product, making the microbes on your farm, so in your local environment. So again, a compost, for example. So you're at least getting, again, some of the native organisms who are adapted to your environment in growing in your on your farm in that environment, so that when you apply them, they're more likely to survive and thrive. So DIY type products, I think, are then my second order. And third and last, then I would put commercial products, buying in lab-based a lab culture of various types of things. I would put this third. So it should be in that order. Feed who's already there. If you're going to introduce new ones, make them yourself on farm. And third and finally, buy in external products in that order. Okay, so that's kind of my view on that. And I think that there's that question we had about what's maybe some of the untapped potential. Here's maybe a nice example. This was from an interesting paper published earlier this year that was coming out in some regards to critique the classic soil, the disease triangle, the pathogen triangle, which is that classic view that says, well, in order to have disease, first we must have the host plant present, then we must have the pathogen present, but then we must have the right environmental conditions for that pathogen to cause disease. And if you've got the host present, if the pathogen is present, but the environmental conditions are not right, well, then that pathogen cannot cause disease. Even if the environmental conditions were right, but the pathogen is not present, well, then of course you're not going to cause disease either. So it's this idea that we need these three parts, and when we have the right variables lining up for host, environment, and pathogen, then disease can outbreak. And what this paper was really criticizing is that this is no longer fit for purpose, or it's not that it's wrong per se, but it is incomplete. We're missing a big piece of the puzzle, and the piece of the puzzle that we're missing is that soil microbiome. The classic disease triangle mentions nothing about all of those beneficial microbes in the soil. And those microbes in the soil can directly suppress pathogens. Some of them prey on pathogens, they eat them. Some of them excrete antibiotic, antifungal type substances to suppress those pathogens. But on top of that, that soil microbiome, as I shared an example of earlier, they can also help the plant fuel its own immune system, trigger the production of defense chemicals. So the microbiome can do this to help the plant. And that adds another variable in the classic disease triangle to say that when, depending on the state of the soil, the function of that soil biology, they can further tip the scales, tip the balance in that war between pathogen and host plant, and they are another variable in the mix that, in the classic view of the soil health, in the disease triangle, is just completely excluded. Now, I'll say a quick word on this one, then just to link together this discussion about biofertilizers. We often think, well, why do you bother applying biofertilizers, introducing new microbes to the soil? Does this even happen in nature? And yes, the answer is it does. We have now examples that when the plants are growing, and all those microbes are growing around the roots and in the plants and on the leaf and everywhere, when that plant produces seed, the plant will send these microbes that grow in these unique locations, some in the stem, some on the leaf, some in the roots, some on the flowers, some in the fruit or in the seed. The plant will send these microbes into the seed so that when that seed is dispersed and flies off in the wind or in the washed off in the water, etc., when that seed is spreads out into the ecosystem, it is carrying inside it some of these very same organisms that were growing on the mother plant, and they are there embedded in the seed. So yes, in nature, when seeds move through ecosystems, they are carrying with them a biofertilizer. They are carrying a biome embedded on and in that seed, and those organisms are being introduced into new ecosystems as those plants colonize. So yes, it is a natural thing for biofertilizers, for new microbes to be inoculated into soils. And we are now understanding that these organisms are very, very important for the plant development, for the plant life cycle, that they play very important roles. And one of the main things we know about the seed biome is its role basically in order to, when the seed germinates, it's actually colonized primarily by the seed biome, and only after they start the process, I guess they begin the colonization and they start the communication with the soil biome, with the biome from the soil, the black ones here. So it is the seed biome that germinates first, and they start the communication with the soil biome, and then the soil biome begins to colonize and take over over that plant. And as that plant then germinates and carries on, we find that those organisms that were in the seed, they then migrate upwards and they go live back up here in the next generation. And those soil biome, they generally stay down around the roots as a general rule. So yes, I share that as an example of biofertilizers that it is a natural thing in that sense, and these types of strategies can help with increasing rooting. All of that beneficial biology there can really improve the rooting characteristics. Okay, so onwards to if somebody's got their microphone.
That's us. That's us. Glad you noticed.
Oh.
So I'm gonna keep an eye on the time, and I say about 5 more minutes, and then we will move to some. We have some good questions rolling in the chat, so I want to make sure those get answered. And yeah, we can see. I wish we could be here all day, but just a 5 minute warning there.
Okay, I'm going to have to go very quick. I'll have to start skipping a few slides, and I apologize, but I'll try and we'll get to the kind of the key points here. So, okay, this point about maintain a living root, I know this is going to be one that's a real challenge for you in your northern climate. And that's where I think like the companions are really important here. If you can have an understory companion like this one, so that after harvest, you've already got that soil cover. I know it's going to be a challenge for you to, after harvest, to drill a cover crop. It's just generally not going to be so practical. And so these are the examples here of, can we have a companion, clover understory in this kind of example, clover grass understory, that is then there to provide that soil cover for post-harvest. So over again in Canada, I would say a similar example that they're doing is both at the springtime, at spring, they will drill together a spring crop, so a spring variety, along with something like a winter variety as a companion. So let me just use an example. They'll actually drill, for example, a spring wheat and a winter wheat together in spring. And of course, the winter wheat will not get its vernalization, so it's not going to bolt to seed. So the annual will, sorry, the spring variety will. So it will then go through to heading and it will be combined and you're left with the winter wheat in the understory. Now they don't normally apply winter wheat. They'd normally use a winter variety of something else that's a bit cheaper seed, another like a ryegrass or like some other Italian ryegrass or some other type of a companion there. But the point is if you're applying a winter type variety that's going to stay vegetative, and it won't get so we at least then have this principle of soil cover and living roots. And again, another example of this. Here we have maize, of course, that was undersown with a companion, so that after harvest, you're not having to try and then establish a cover. It's already there, and it will use the last of the sunlight and the temperatures until the end. So I think this is probably a much more appropriate type strategy for a finished context. You've really got to think about some companions, either drilled at springtime or maybe relay drilled, broadcast over. I know broadcasting seed into a standing crop can be a bit hit and miss as well. But some of those types of strategies I think are very, very relevant. I'll skip through minimize disturbance. You all appreciate this. Whatever you can do, if it's min-till, if it's strip-till, if it's just surface cultivation, try and minimize the use of the plow and the full version. It's very disruptive, of course, to the biology. So, and okay, again, I'm not opposed to it. I think in across maybe rotational plowing, but maybe plowing every year, I think we are causing a lot of damage. So strategies that we can try and minimize that soil disturbance. Because of this, we've got to minimize that soil erosion. This is a big problem in many parts of the world, and I think that minimizing disturbance is really key for this. A few quick things on polycultures. I had a few interesting examples here. I'll probably have to skip a couple of these just for brevity, but I think you all be fairly familiar with some of the idea around diversity. It's really just trying to increase the diversity of the agricultural system. And you're having that conversation today through the use of forestry, through trees, for trees with cropping, trees with animals, trees for wild spaces. You know, there's all sorts of benefits to both ecology and productivity in terms of bringing in those trees. So, of course, that's the conversation you're having today. But, you know, there's other ways in terms of then thinking about non-productive areas, biodiversity strips and field margins, you know, some of this kind of ecological infrastructure, as you can see here. And also then even within the cropping phase, within the productive phase, can we use novel cash crops, wider rotations, a mixture of annuals, perennials, summer, winter type plants, or some of the cover crops, the companions like we talked about, which can then be cover crops for the winter, intercropping, that type of a thing. And really, I'll just emphasize here. I think a picture says 1,000 words. I think you could see the benefit with diversity, plant species diversity, comes a diversity of roots, comes a diversity of root structures, architecture, root depth, comes a diversity of those root exudates. And it is this diversity of root exudates that then can trigger unique expression in the soil biome over and above what we see under a monoculture situation. And this kind of overlaps with that discussion about quorum sensing, where then we have different root exudates, different microbial growth, proliferation, which can then trigger unique expression from down there in the soil back up into the plant community. And diversity is one tool we can also use to help kind of facilitate that. I just have some pictures here of some diverse systems, diverse pasture on the right hand side. This is just a simple little two-way intercrop. And really this is what I was kind of talking about just there. By having the two plants together, we are encouraging a synergy, an interaction. This is 1 + 1 = 3. If you were to study this cereal in monoculture on its own, if you were to go and study the legume in monoculture on its own, you will not observe this interaction. There is a synergy between them where the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And that's really the essence of one of the benefits of diversity, is that we're looking for these interactions and for unique properties to emerge out of that we wouldn't normally find, that we wouldn't normally observe under a monocultural situation. I'll skip over that one. I had this one in here especially for you guys, just talking about how trees, and I'm sure you'll probably talk about this in the rest of your sessions today, but indeed how they can also support beneficial insects and other pollination services, but also at the same time reducing our pests. So I'm also a keen supporter of the agroforestry type movement and practices that are emerging in the last few years. It seems to be gaining a lot more traction. It's also here in the UK and over in Ireland. I know other parts of Europe are also really starting to explore and understand how trees can also play a role. Cover crops, I won't dwell on. I think the main thing I wanted to point out here is that this is a photo from Scotland, also quite northern climate, short growing season. And I just want to point out that this is it's taken from the same photo, same day, same field, same day, three different photos. I just want to point out that we might look at this cover crop and say, well, it looks a little small. It's only a few inches tall. But I just want to emphasize that I know that you may never get these big showy cover crops like you've seen, I'm sure, on YouTube and online, which they do over in America and all of this kind of thing. You just don't have the window to produce these big biomass cover crops. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And I think this is a great example of this. It might look a bit small, a bit thin, a bit patchy, only a few inches tall, but this is taken from the same field on the same day. And look at this root biomass happening below ground. Plants will grow roots and establish their roots predominantly first before they really then grow upwards and establish their canopy. So I would still argue that even in narrow windows of time, even if your cover crop is only a few inches tall, I would still say that there's a lot of benefit to what's happening below ground here, even in this fairly small, limited kind of cover crop. This was an example of a companion crop just helping out with establishment like a nurse crop. So this was on linseed or flax. I'm not sure what you guys call it there, linseed or flax. And this is the flax can be very susceptible to a beetle, flax beetle. And this was just an interesting photo, a companion nurse crop where we have some oats drilled along with the flax here. And that's just to kind of confuse the beetle so that the flax can get established. And once the flax is established, the oats are sprayed out, so they're terminated. But the oats have done their job in terms of helping the establishment of the flax. And so this photo here, this is where the oats are still present, and this is later on and where they have been sprayed out. So now the oats are gone, but you can still see distinctly that line that these established better, and now they're off to a better start. As compared to where there was no oat companions. So again, I just kind of share a nice example. Lastly, livestock. I know this one will be a challenge for some of you, but there's a lot of benefits to one, the perennial plants, the nature of that they grow more roots and allocate more carbon. We also have the opportunity for diversity, as you can see here, a lot of diverse pastures, so that's also very good. And then it's really about how we graze those. When we graze those plants, we keep them in a vegetative state, and that keeps a lot of root activity and root exudation happening. So there's a lot of benefits to the perennial system. And also, this is just a nice little example, the impact of the hoof, the interaction of the animal with the soil. And this was a neat study comparing leaving litter on the soil, so no trampling, or including a little bit of livestock interaction and having some trampling just to increase the accessibility of that litter to those hungry mouths, to those microorganisms down here. They can't get up to the litter when it's on the surface, but when it is incorporated, then they get access. And overall, this led to an increase in soil organic matter formation just from that little bit of mild incorporation. So again, the impact of animals in terms of incorporation, but in terms of perennials, the plants, the grazing habit there, all of this can also help. And so I've gone really quickly. I apologize through that, but we can have some question time and kind of get to your context. But just to say that to that question also earlier, yes, I'm acknowledging that a lot of this is a lot really complex. It's kind of a big picture. It's a big macro system. This kind of idea of holistic management. It is knowledge intensive, and that is one of its great challenges. The way in which we do farming and agriculture now is very input intensive. It's very, in a way, we've boiled it down, we've simplified it to these simple kind of calendar rules, but we've become very dependent on inputs because of that. And if we want to liberate ourselves and free ourselves from that input dependency, the key is that we do need more knowledge. We have to deal with this compaction in the mind. And that is where, again, I acknowledge it's complex, big systems. And that's why coming to days like today is important. But again, I think it's the beauty of following the basic rules, the overarching simple rules to manage that complexity. And I think that to close, this might be my last slide, that just a nice example of this, that it is important to kind of try and manage for the whole, manage for the system. I think one of the, of course, science is a wonderful tool that we use. Reductionist science has been wonderful in terms of breaking down this complexity into understanding small pieces of the puzzle, which then help us try to understand how the big one works. But that is also, there's a negatives to that reduction approach. If we boil things down to the minutiae and we study things in isolation, we lose sight of the whole, we lose sight of that picture. And here's a great example here. If you have an understanding of each and every little piece and the parts and every little thing that's happening here, and if you study each of these individually, you will not have a functional car. The only way to make this car functional is to understand not just each piece and what it does in isolation, but how it interacts with others. And it is through the interaction between all of the parts all at the same time working together, only then does a usable functional vehicle emerge. And this is really the idea of holistic management or systems thinking. It says, look, try to think about the whole, because if you go too deep into all of the reductionist specifics, we can lose sight of the whole. So what's really important is the interaction between the components of the chemistry, the physics, the biology, managing the whole system so that all of those parts interact. And when they interact, unique properties can emerge from that soul function, things that are not observable otherwise, as I mentioned in the other lecture, and equally in this analogy. We will only have a usable, functional car if these pieces are assembled and interact with each other. Then we achieve much greater and useful functionality out of that vehicle. Okay, sorry, I know we went very, very fast there, so let's dive into some quick questions.
All right, great. So we have about 5 minutes left. I've got some questions here in the chat. So we're going to bias towards the chat for the first question, if I can waste our time looking at the questions. Ready to go. Okay, so again from Guru, I have been thinking about industrial scale agriculture, whether organic or not in terms of really feeding the world, but the small scale family farms, backyard gardens producing most of the actually eaten food. How could we transition back to human/social scale food production, or transition the industrial side, maybe make small scale more effective or less burdensome state to farm in, right? So how can we, some general thoughts on that, because we have some other questions too.
Yeah, it's kind of a big one. It's hard to give a simple answer to that, isn't it? I really agree. I think that small scale systems are so much more efficient. It is the scaling up in which we lose efficiency. So I really agree with the premise of your question for sure. But we also have to acknowledge a bit of a limitation here. Unfortunately, a lot of people, this is maybe a bit of a generalization, but a lot of people do not like doing hard work these days, do not like working on doing manual labor. This is one of the problems we've faced in industrial ag, where we've used mechanization to address this. But I know that that's changing. I know there's more and more city folk who do want to get out into the land and connect with the land and grow food. But of course, then there's barriers of capital and land access and all of those kind of things. So your question is really big. It brings up a lot of both social, biological, economic kind of considerations here. It's certainly a big challenge, and I think that food education would be part of my answer. Just really helping consumers understand the importance of sourcing food and therefore how to grow it, how to produce it, but also education at the farmer level in terms of helping them maybe think about novel ways in which they can produce food by downsizing, that have to get bigger, that they can get smaller but become more higher value, more intensive. So maybe the education that comes with that as well. Okay, do we have a question from the audience here?
2 hours. Okay.
Well, maybe,
It's
yeah.
gonna heckle you guys.
We heard the word compost several times, and we were also trying to do bokashi. So would you have any comments comparing them in regards to feeding the community in the soil?
Sure. Yep. This is a good one. Look, I support them both. I think that aerobic versus anaerobic composting processes, they're just different, and I see them as very complementary. One is going to encourage different groups of microbes, the aerobic ones, and as they grow and excrete all of their various metabolites and things, that's great, and that's different to the anaerobic microbes and some of their different metabolites and things that they do. And I think the perfect analogy I could give you to kind of why I would support use of both of these as complementary is the slide that I put up about showing you the aggregation. We pull the soil particles together into the aggregate and we create the pore space in between. So thinking about soils are a mixture of both aerobic and anaerobic zones. Inside that aggregate is low oxygen, anaerobic, but through the pore space is high oxygen, aerobic. And that's why I would say that they're very complementary, because you're making a compost that produces the organisms. Some will thrive in those aggregates and some will thrive on the outsides around those aggregates. So in that view, I think they're very complementary.
Thank you.
All right, Joel, do you have time for 2 more questions about that length? You really stay
Yes.
over a couple minutes? I appreciate that.
I can. I've got a few extra minutes. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the audience real quick. Madhuri, your question about soil carbon saturation, were you satisfied with the chat answer, or do you want me to direct that to Joel real quick? Is anyone else getting ready in here? Because this is where we're going next. Okay, all right, let me read this question then. Let me scroll up a bit. Okay. Joel, do you reckon soil can be saturated with carbon at some stage after a long period of regenerative management? I.e., will soil stop to sequester carbon at some point?
It's a good question. It really, the best way to answer this, I'm trying to be brief here, of course, is that when we say soil carbon, when we say soil organic matter, we are doing it a great disservice by calling it one thing. There's many different types or qualities of the soil organic matter. And when we tease them apart, this is where we get a nuanced answer to your question. So some of the soil organic matter, some of the soil carbon is attached to mineral surfaces, to the clay colloids. This is why we say clay soils can sequester more carbon, because they have lots of clay colloids, which then can stick to soil carbon and sequester it. That's called mineral associated organic matter. And the general view is that yes, that is the fraction that will saturate, because once the clay's mineral surfaces are covered in carbon, there's no more car park, there's no more spaces in the car park, so we can't get more carbon in. So that fraction, the mineral associated fraction, yes, it is thought to have, and there is debate on this, but for the most part, yes, that does saturate. However, we have another fraction of carbon in soils called particulate organic carbon. And this is the fraction that is made up of all of those plant remains in various kind of states of decay. And these fractions of carbon, they can get sequestered in those physically in those aggregates that I also spoke about. And we then have some evidence that shows that that fraction of soil carbon does not seem to saturate, because that fraction of carbon is not dependent on the mineral surfaces to adhere to. And so that fraction of carbon is found a lot more dominant in forest-based ecosystems. So in forests, you have a lot of that fraction, this particulate organic carbon. For example, as you could appreciate with the leaf litter, the mulch layer, all the leaves fall down, we have that mulch layer. As long as that just keeps getting deposited, that will then be sequestering this, but down as it integrates down into the soil, this particulate organic carbon. So that is the fraction that does not seem to saturate. And we could use the analogy of a peat soil, for example, there. But the fraction that sticks to the clay surfaces, that is the fraction that does saturate. So it's a mixture of both.
Great. No hands? No hands? Okay, one more from the chat. I don't want Joel to miss his flight. I know what that's like.
I've got
this is a great one to end on, because this is something that hasn't been touched on. Chris says, as a mushroom farmer, oyster mushroom farmer, we sometimes have contaminated substrates. The common green mold we call trichoderma species, thousands of them, have you experimented with this source of trichoderma? Green molds.
So many of the trichoderma species are that green color, and yes, I know that for you in a mushroom production, they're a huge problem. They're a pest, aren't they? Because that trichoderma will actually eat your mushroom producing fungus. So it's a pest in that sense. But in the rest of agriculture, we often use trichoderma as a pest control, as a fungal disease control agent, because it does eat or consume or digest. It's a predatory fungus. It does digest other fungi, and so it can also digest pathogenic fungi. It can prey on pathogenic fungi. So yes, I've used that a lot in agriculture. It's a somewhat fairly common and commercialized product out there these days. There are DIY methods to make it, culture it yourself. And yes, it can help suppress disease very effectively. But in your context, I'm sure it's probably not so good to have too much of that one, because you want your mushroom producing fungus to be the dominant one.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Joel. We know that you have a flight to catch, and I see some hungry faces. Don't worry, we didn't cut into your time. We've got an hour until 12:30. So I would like to do something that's not so common maybe in Finland. We'll do a short round of applause for Joel for pulling this off. Thank you. Thank you, Joel, so much. We'll be in touch about slides and other things, and we wish you all the best as you're visiting us here in Europe this winter. So if you see anything cool, you just let us know on your social media, which you can follow him on social media. He doesn't use it as much as he would if you would follow him and like his post. I'm just kidding. So thank you, Joel. We're gonna go take some lunch, and take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. A real pleasure.